Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is David Medina, and I'm the co-founder and COO of Results for America. And we're proud to be co-hosting today's session with our partners, the U.S. Conference of Mayors and Bloomberg Philanthropies. And we want to start off on a very positive note. We want to congratulate every local government leader on this webinar today who has secured federal infrastructure funding to date. Please give yourselves a big pat on the back. Congratulations, you did it. And today, our hope is that all of you leave today's session with the insights and the support that you need to get the rest of your grant applications over the finish line. Want to remind you all that we're here to support you every step of the way as you move forward in getting your grant agreements submitted and approved and signed so that you can deliver safer roads, cleaner air and water, electrical vehicle charging for your cars, and more for your residents. So today we'll be hearing from federal government officials, policy experts, and local government leaders on best practices for finalizing federal grant proposals and how to avoid unnecessary delays. And so now I'm very pleased to welcome Stephanie Pollock. She's the Senior Advisor for the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Project Implementation at the U.S. Department of Transportation. So Stephanie, thanks for joining us today. The Zoom is now yours.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. I'm really glad to be here. So, I'm going to try to give an overview, and then I'm happy to answer your questions, of which I'm sure there are many. I think most of you know how federal grants, discretionary grants work, but I want to sort of start at the beginning so you can understand why the grant agreements are so important and where they come in. So the vast majority of competitive grant programs, at least at the U.S. Department of Transportation, are reimbursable. Which means you lay out the money and then you ask us to give that money to you. Giving money to you in reimbursement is called outlaying in federal budgetary parlance. We can't outlay any money under a grant until that grant has been obligated. There are two steps for a grant to become legally and budgetarily obligated, which then allows us to actually reimburse you. The first step is that both the Department of Transportation and the grantee have to execute a grant agreement. And that's mostly what we're going to talk about this afternoon. And the second step is that the department has to obligate the money in a financial system. Now, many of you may have noticed that even if you get a grant that comes from the Office of the Secretary, like a RAISE grant or a Safe Streets for All grant, the Office of the Secretary doesn't actually have a budget system in which grants are obligated. Only our operating administrations, like the Federal Highway Administration, the Federal Transit Administration, have those. So the grants, after the grant agreement is executed, those operating administrations have to obligate it in the financial system. The good news is we've been working really hard on that step, and now it's generally 1 or 2 days at most after we have an executed grant agreement for obligation, and that's why we can focus on the grant agreement side. I will say, if you feel like you've signed a grant agreement and you're not hearing that it's been obligated, or you try to put in for reimbursement, you should talk to your point of contact that you were assigned back when you got your grant, because that shouldn't be happening at this point. The other reason that obligated funds are really important, and that folks are focused on them right now, in addition to the fact that we can't legally reimburse you, is that unobligated fund balances in any federal budget line are subject to what's called rescission. Now, despite what you may have heard, rescission is not a unilateral action that can be taken by the executive branch. Rescission is an action that has to be taken by Congress in a budget bill and then signed by the president. That said, in my time at USDOT in the last 4 years, we've already had a rescission as part of the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which was the deal to not default on our Treasury bills, which I think we all agree is a good outcome. And President Biden, in order to negotiate that deal, did in fact have to rescind some unobligated balances under some of the COVID laws. So, given upcoming budget negotiations, given statements that have been made about policy, given that the debt ceiling expires again at the end of December, it is possible that rescission of unobligated funds could be on the table in the Congress in 2025. And so the better the better practice at this point is to try to get your funds obligated. And then if there is a rescission, your funds are protected from rescission because they're not in the unobligated balances. So how do you make that happen? You make that your part of it really is the signing of the grant agreement. Um, uh, when you get a grant, there's usually there's a webinar and you're congratulated, you're assigned a point of contact from one of the operating administrations. Usually for each grant program, there are two dates that are important. One is the obligation deadline. That is the drop dead date. If you don't obligate your grant by that date, if you don't have that executed grant agreement, you actually lose the money. It's called lapsing. It doesn't even require a rescission. That's the date most folks have focused on. Those dates may be 2 or 3 years down the road. So what we're all working on at DOT is not sort of seeing that date as the target, but in fact seeing, let's get the grant agreement signed and the funds obligated as soon as possible. But that is the drop dead date. And then the second date, just so I'm complete in my explanation, is called the period of performance. There is a final date by which we can't reimburse you anymore. So if you got a grant this year, you may be told that the obligation deadline is September 30th of 2026 or 2027. That's the last date by which you can obligate, but we could obligate it, tomorrow. It's not, you don't have to wait until then. And then there's a period of performance that might be another 3 years. And then after September 30th of 2030, even if you're still building your project, we can't outlay it anymore. So that's basically how grants work. So what do we need to be able to sign a grant agreement with you? Well, the first step, the ball's in our court. DOT writes what we call a template, which is sort of an outline of the key provisions that we need to see in a grant agreement. We send that out. Again, we're working really hard to try to get those templates out faster. In many grant programs, we're now sending you the templates when we tell you you have your grant. But if you got your grant a couple years ago, you may have had to wait months to get your template. And so that got the process off to a slower start. Now, again, we know our best practice is not to have that delay. You need to take that template that's sent to you, and you need to work in your organization and with your Department of Transportation point of contact to get to mutually agreeable language. I will tell you that we have, I don't know, 4,000 or so grants that we've made just under the first 3 years of the bipartisan infrastructure law. DOT staff may not have enough time to do a lot of nudging, so they may just send you your template. And if they don't hear for weeks or months, they may not actually be pinging you and saying, hey, have you had a chance to look at that template? Do you have any questions? We try to, but we may not be able to. So that's when the ball's really in your court. The faster you look at that template and get back to us, either with changes or with questions, the faster the process goes towards getting a grant agreement. Now, there's one prerequisite that's really critically important, that without which we cannot obligate any of our grants, and that is called the match. You all know that grants come with match requirements, but you may not realize that there's no way for us to sign a grant agreement unless we have that matching information in place. So what I've hopefully now shared on my screen is a page from the U.S. Department of Transportation's Navigator website, which is our technical assistance website, which I encourage everyone to use, which has great information on match, when we're allowed to actually waive the match requirement. In other words, when you can use 100% of the grant without any local or state funding. Where there's flexibility, if you're a Justice 40 community. So you gotta, the two things you need to do is for any grant is you need to come up with the match and be able to articulate to us where that comes from. And you need to get back to us with any changes you want to make in the template to the grant agreement. If you have a planning grant, at that point, we're good. Those are the only really two steps. Those two steps can take months or years, but they are the only two steps. And construction grants are much more complicated because there are more prerequisites before we can obligate a grant that you're going to use to physically build something. And because there are actually more options for how to obligate grant funds when we're giving you a grant to physically build something. So the most important additional prerequisite for a construction grant, as opposed to, say, a planning grant, is compliance with the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. For most of our grant programs, it is actually statutorily prohibited to obligate the grant without NEPA having been completed. So it's not even something that we can waive if we wanted to try to be helpful to you. Now, I'm happy to answer more questions about NEPA, but basically there's different levels of NEPA requirements. The easiest one in theory is called the categorical exclusion. And if your project is eligible for a categorical exclusion, then the best way forward is to work again with your federal point of contact, get that categorical exclusion, get a piece of paper that says your project is categorically excluded. And then at that point, you can obligate the entire construction grant. And all of the funds, which is our goal here. If you are not eligible for a categorical exclusion, if you need to do a more complicated document called an environmental assessment or an environmental impact statement, that is going to take you longer. So historically, the Department of Transportation has basically told grantees in those situations, go through your NEPA process. An environmental assessment usually takes at least a year. An environmental impact statement usually takes at least 2. When you're done, come back to us. But we understand that that's a problem. And we also understand that for some grantees, they can't actually, they need the resources in the grant to do the environmental assessment or the EIS. So you get stuck in this do loop where you can't get it obligated. So recently we have started doing more phased obligation, which means we can sign a grant agreement with you and we can give you some money for pre-construction activities, including permitting, including doing NEPA, including the design work that you need to do permitting. So say you have a $50 million construction grant, we might agree with you that the first $2 million can go to pre-construction. We can do that even if you didn't ask for it to go to pre-construction in your original application. And then you can sign that grant agreement, and the first phase will be pre-construction activities. We will only obligate that smaller amount, and you will only have to match that smaller amount at that point. And then you'll come to another phase, which is your main construction phase. And we can talk more in the Q&A about that. The other thing I just want to mention is an option that some of you may have heard about from the DOT is called pre-award authority. This is used a lot by the Federal Railroad Administration, the Federal Transit Administration, and the Maritime Administration, more than it is by Federal Highway. The important thing to understand about pre-award authority is it's basically a piece of paper that says we are pre-approving certain expenses you're going to incur, and when your grant is obligated, we're pretty much going to automatically give you that money. So it's certainly better than nothing, but it is important to understand it is not obligation. And if funds are rescinded after we give you pre-award authority and before you actually obligate, we basically can't give you the money, even though we gave pre-award authority. So we're sort of honestly trying to use phased obligation more and pre-award authority less. But if you're in a complicated grant situation like that, you should definitely be talking to your point of contact. So I'm going to actually stop so we have plenty of time for questions. But the last point I would make is just we're trying to change the culture at DOT from one in which a grant is successful as long as it doesn't lapse, meaning as long as we get it obligated before whatever the deadline is, to a culture in which our goal is to work with our grantees to get grants obligated as soon as the grantee is ready to obligate. But it is definitely a partnership between DOT and the grantee to get through the obligation process. And so it's going to take both parties to that process if the goal is to shorten up that obligation period, to simplify that grant agreement, and to get the money into your hands sooner and in a state where it would be protected from rescission. So with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you and happy to answer any questions you may have.
Stephanie, thank you so much. You're the perfect featured speaker from the federal government for our 75th session of our local infrastructure hub. Thank you. You're helping us figure out how to bring home the bacon, so to speak, to all of our cities. So thank you. Now I'd like to open it up, our session, to all of the questions from all of you. We already have some questions rolling in. So Stephanie, can you just start with like the programs that are eligible for phased agreements? Who needs to agree to proceed with that phased approach? Any more
So,
comments on that?
yep, great question. So obviously both parties do. In some cases now, the Department of Transportation will actually kind of offer it if it's a big construction grant, like our last round of mega grants. We actually, in the initial webinar and templates, said to people, hey, folks, what about a grant agreement? A phased agreement. We've also been doing that with the Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods construction grants, not the planning grants, because that funding is actually from the Inflation Reduction Act. There's been some talk about potential rescission of unobligated balances, so we wanted to offer grantees the option to do phasing. But if you're not offered that option, you can always ask.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from El Paso. What kind of internal processes can we initiate before receiving and finalizing an award agreement? For example, can we start contracting vendors or visiting project sites?
So any money that you want to spend after you've been selected for a grant that you want to be eligible for reimbursement, that's where you either need to sign the grant agreement, that becomes the start date for being reimbursed, or you need to get pre-award authority if it's a program that has it. If you haven't done either of those, you're welcome to do whatever you want, but it will not be reimbursable under the grant.
Great. And we have a question from John, and I'm not going to try to say your last name, but it's in the chat. Is the full match commitment a bond resolution, for example, always required at time of grant agreement execution in the case of an implementation construction grant?
That is a great question. One of the other advantages of phased obligation is we only need the match for the phase. So if you have a $50 million construction project and you want a $2 million pre-construction phase, we only need match for the 2 million when the grant agreement is signed, and we'll need the construction match later when you finish NEPA and permitting. So if you're in a position where you're still trying to get your match funds for construction lined up, phased obligation might be a good option.
Great. And we have a question from Bill for RCN planning grant. I think FHWA has said that they want to phase it based on NEPA approval. This seems risky. Any advice?
If you can get NEPA done, I would not phase it. It depends. If the reason that they want to phase it, the question is how much NEPA do you need to do, right? Do you need to do 2 months of NEPA or 2 years of NEPA? If you want to do 2 years, it's less risky to phase it because at least you get a signed document and you get the phase 1 money. If you really could finish NEPA, I have to say, and I will say this to this group, we have grantees who use the NEPA process as kind of their community engagement. And they take it slowly because community engagement's important. It's important to you, and honestly, it's important to us. But legally, you can keep doing community engagement from the first day till the last day. And if you can speed up NEPA and separate it from a broader community conversation and get NEPA done, you can get your entire grant obligated instead of doing it in phases. That might be a better approach right now.
Great. And a question from Ian. For phase obligation, can funds obligated in earlier phases be rolled into later phases if not spent or used?
I don't actually know the answer to that. That is a great question. I'm going to get back to you folks with that so you can share it with the people on this webinar because I don't want to give you incorrect information.
Great. And we will go ahead and do that. So thanks for that great question. Next, are there any technical assistance resources available for NEPA?
So the best place to educate yourself about NEPA as a start is to go to the website of our Center of Excellence at Volpe for project delivery, which has a project delivery toolkit. And in that toolkit, there's a NEPA page. And the reason that I tell people that that's the best place to go is because unfortunately, from a perspective of complexity, the NEPA rules are actually different for every mode. And so what we tried to do with the project delivery toolkit is to put all the NEPA requirements in one place. Even the FAA and even pipeline and hazardous material, like less common grants. So you can go there. And there are also some free training resources on NEPA. If that's not enough and you actually need like a human being to help you with NEPA, If you're in the Thriving Communities program, they may be able to help you. If you have a Reconnecting grant and you're part of the Reconnecting Communities Institute, they may be able to help you. And if you let your point of contact know that you're struggling with NEPA, there are some internal resources. We have an internal thing called the Project Initiation Accelerator. You can't apply for it. We just have some consultant funds that we can make available if the grantee and the operating administration do it. So there are some resources. I'd start with seeing if you can sort of do self-help, but if you really are lost, I would encourage you to talk to the technical assistance folks. And again, all the technical assistance resources can be found and sorted out at the DOT Navigator website.
And maybe I'll just jump in there too. The local infrastructure hub is offering one-on-one assistance to help cities that are struggling with being able to finalize a grant agreement, whether that's NEPA or other things. So we're gonna be putting up a poll. We'll also put a survey in the chat. If you need help, please let us know, and we want to help you.
Great. And a question from Brianna regarding SS4A. What are the pros and cons of overmatching to supplement activities when we are partially awarded?
I think that is so dependent on the individual project or grant that it's something that you should work out with your POC. It might allow you to put more activities into earlier phases, and the earlier phases, the first phase is the only one that's they're obligated one phase at a time. So if you want to obligate more money and you have more match available and you can negotiate putting more activities into an earlier phase, then the money is more locked down.
Great. And we have a question from San Diego. What program requirements should we look out for in the NOFO prior to applying to ensure timely execution of the grant agreement?
So that's a great question. There's actually a checklist on DOT Navigator called Project Readiness Checklist. And the idea of that is like for you to make sure that you're not applying too early. Because, for example, if you apply for a project that needs 3 years of NEPA and has a 2-year obligation deadline, like from day one, you're behind the 8 ball, right? Like we're going to award you your grant in December of 2024, and you're going to be told you have to finish in 26 and you haven't started NEPA. So I'd take a look at the checklist, but so that's the most important is to understand what you think the construction schedule is for your grant and when that outside obligation deadline is and when that outside period of performance is. And if your whole construction schedule doesn't fit in to that period of performance, you're probably in the wrong year of grant competition.
Great. And one last question that's pretty broad, but important. What is the most important thing cities have control over that they can leverage to help speed up their grant process?
I'm not sure I could give you one thing. I'll name 3 things that
We'll take them all.
Yeah, I mean, we've been going through a process where we took one set of grants to see how quickly we could try to get them obligated. And it helped us identify honestly where we could go faster, and we're trying to learn from that. The 3 most common reasons that we heard in that process where we offered to grantees to get grants obligated faster, and they said, we actually can't do it that fast. So number 1 was they didn't actually have match, right? Like they were required to have match and the money isn't in this, but it's not, you know, it's in a bill that the governor filed, or they're going to flex money, but they haven't gone through the process. And the lawyers have said, I've actually asked this question myself, in the absence of match, there's nothing we can do about obligations. So if you can't, and to know how much the match is, we need to know your project budget. So the most important thing that you can do is figure out your project budget and schedule, know what your match rules are, and then make sure that you can identify the match for the amount of budget that you want, either for the whole grant or not. All that's in your control. We look at that, and we may ask you questions, but we don't tell you when to finish your project or how long it's going to take or what it's going to cost. You tell us and we review it. So if you're waiting on a template, work on project schedule, work on project budget, work on match. And then so the decision at the beginning of the NEPA process is called a class of action. It's when we tell you, is it a categorical exclusion? Do we require an environmental assessment? Sometimes people get questioned, and it's on us. We make that decision. But sometimes what will happen is the point of contact will say, I need XYZ information so I can make that decision. And the grantee doesn't understand how important it is. Like, and so literally no one is working on your NEPA class of action decision if they're waiting for data from you, right? Because they need to know certain information to know if you trigger a certain threshold, which would turn it from a categorical exclusion. So, and sometimes I love all of our points of contacts, but they're really busy. They have lots of grantees. Not all of them are NEPA experts. If you are asked for information, if you haven't been told what your NEPA requirement is going to be for a construction project, and you've been asked for information, it's really important to get back with that information. And if you can't, if you need technical assistance, if you don't understand, if you're drowning, you need to tell somebody. Because again, our people, even though we encourage them to, may not have the bandwidth to reach back out and say, hey, I asked you for that information 2 months ago and I haven't seen it yet. So we're not doing anything. So those are the two I would say that are in people's controls. The last one is this. Some people apply for grants without thinking about whether they're going to deliver the grant or whether they want to ask a partner, a state DOT, a transit agency, someone else to do the delivery. The grant agreement gets signed with whoever is doing the delivery. We have a process by which DOT can approve the delivery of a grant that was awarded to one entity to another, but it does take time. So think about project delivery. And if you come to the conclusion that you voluntarily, we cannot tell you to, but if you voluntarily think that it will help your project to ask another entity in your state to deliver it for you, tell us as soon as you can and work that arrangement out, because we're then going to have to do the grant agreement with that entity. Those are the three biggest things I would say that are in the grantee's control that can hold up grant agreements.
Stephanie, thanks again for the insights, for answering all these questions. And a quick note to everyone who's with us today, many of the answers to the questions that we talked about today and to the questions that we weren't able to get to in the chat are answered in a new resource that we've put together that outlines strategies for getting your grant agreement signed. We're going to post that right now in the chat. You can also find it on our website. So thanks again, Stephanie. I'm now pleased to welcome a partner in crime, Jamie Lavin, a partner at Bloomberg Philanthropies, who is one of the strongest advocates for mayors, for city governments you'll find anywhere in the country. So Jamie will be moderating our policy panel. So Jamie, over to you.
Thank you so much, David, and just want to echo your thanks to Stephanie. Our federal partners are working night and day under very difficult circumstances to get as many of these dollars out to your communities. And so we just want to really thank you and your colleagues for the great work you're doing for helping cities really understand what they need to do next to make sure that these projects get realized. So thank you. Stephanie has also offered to answer as many of the questions that have come in, whether she can answer them or we're taking. If there were a Safe Streets question, we'll take them back to our Safe Streets counterparts at DOT and get you all answers, because our main interest is in making sure that the 4,000 discretionary projects that have received financing or have been awarded actually become obligated, and then we see the real results on the ground. And so we're going to focus next on two things. One is talking to some of the experts who are working with lots of cities on what are they seeing, what are they helping the cities do to make sure that they lock up the funds, what are the strategies that they can share. So we're going to bring Brant Herzenstein, who's a program manager at the Electrification Coalition, and Michelle Ruse, who's the executive director of the Environmental Protection Network, and to help us really think about what are the ways that cities can move this money. And then we're also be joined by Jake Brower, who's the Chief Strategy Officer for Lansing, Michigan. Mayor Shore has been a big participant of the local infrastructure hub, and I know has been very focused on bringing every dollar of bipartisan infrastructure law money home to Lansing to address critical needs. and Allison Anderson, who's an engineer manager for the Department of Public Works in Columbia, Missouri, and Krista Schaus-Jones, who's the Vision Zero coordinator from Columbia, Missouri, and Mayor Buffalo heads up the U.S. Conference of Mayors Environmental Committee and is a strong partner on all things. I know has been very, very successful in leveraging bipartisan infrastructure law dollars. And so maybe I'll start with Brant. Brant, I know that you all, Electrification Coalition, have been helping cities that won charging and fueling infrastructure grants. Can you tell us a little bit about what are the main barriers that you're seeing for CFI winners, and what are you all recommending to cities to do between now and January 20th to get those CFI grants signed?
Yeah, so we've had the fortune of working with many of the round 1B winners in charging and fueling infrastructure and some of those that are in the round 1A as well. And one of the things that we saw was there's a lot of first-time winners or a lot of people who have not gone through this process before, and they're asking a lot of questions. And don't get me wrong, the DOT FHWA is doing everything they can. They've got their state point of contact for FHWA. I'm sure in many of the other grants as well, you have that point of contact. But still, there's this desire to get the grant agreement done very quickly, and there's things that maybe people haven't even heard of. So I remember being back on the introductory call for all those award winners, and there's a transportation improvement plans that have the grant or the contract or the grant has to go into it before you can even start the contract negotiations for FHWA, and that was very new to people. And so what we saw was that a lot of these awardees are having the same questions. And so what we decided to do was try and get as many people in that are in the 1B and in this situation where they don't exactly know what they're doing, but want to get this done as quickly as possible. So we started a peer learning session. And so our first one was mid-November, and we're going to continue to have them up until the end of January, and we may have them even farther beyond, because originally the idea was let's try and get all these grants contracted out as quickly as possible. And the first learning session was really great. So we took all the 1B winners that wanted to go. We had about 45 people on the call, and we brought someone who has already won 1A on to talk about their challenges, to talk about their solutions to some of the problems that they were having. And it was a really just like informal but necessary discussion of different aspects of the contract negotiations. One of the questions I saw that was asked in the question in the chat was, for phase obligations, can funds obligated in earlier phases be rolled into later phases if not spent and used? Again, this comes from a person that was on the call that was talking with their FHWA contact. They said that any unused funds in phase 1 of their project could be rolled over into phase 2. They said that the FHWA wants to make sure that they use all the funds that have been obligated to them, and they don't want to take any of it back. So, this is just the type of questions and answers. Speaking of that one, some of you may be asking, well, what percent maybe should I be asking for the pre-phase versus the actual construction phase? Within that, it was 10 to 15% on the pre-phase, and then 85 to 90% on the construction phase. So just to give you an idea of what people are talking about in this. So for any of those people who are interested in what we've been talking about just in CFI, can be applied to a broader aspect of grant awardee winners, and we'd be more than happy to share that.
And maybe I'll just bring Jake into the conversation. Jake, I know that Lansing won a charging and fueling infrastructure grant. What were the things that you really had to work through to be able to get that grant agreement signed? Jake,
for us, it was particularly exciting and engaging in that I was thrown into the process partway through the grant. And so there was a different lead on the project. They left the city. And so right in the middle of the process of negotiating the grant agreement, finalizing these details, I was suddenly exposed to a lot of questions and about, hey, do you have this requirement, state transportation improvement plan, and so forth. And so for us, it was really generally helpful that we had a broad team together And so working in the mayor's office, I had direct access to talking to the public service department, the attorney's office, all the requisite partners that really have the subject matter expertise to make it go forward. And even some questions that I answered with various groups. Occasionally I'd get a question wrong, and then I'd realize that, oh, our local transportation improvement plan automatically updates into our state transportation improvement plan. And so got some corrections down the line, got everyone together, and that ultimately US Department of Transportation, they wanted our project to succeed. We wanted our project to succeed. And so we're all working together to meet that middle ground and answer the questions. But largely it's getting the right people in the room who have the understanding, the engineers, the people who work on the day-to-day responsibilities that go into this.
Yeah,
Did I
definitely
veer too
important to
far
have the
from
right
the
team.
original question?
Yeah, well, we'll come back to you. Let's maybe pivot next to Krista. Krista, I know that you have been working on Columbia's Safe Streets and Roads for All grant. Can you tell us a little bit about that process? What's been easy, what's been hard, and what have you learned along the way?
You've learned a lot. So when you introduce us as experts, no pressure there. Um, Stephanie did a great job of covering, I think, emphasizing even staying in close contact with our FHWA point of contact person. She has been a godsend, honestly. She was very upfront at the beginning about how with the first set of grants, they were learning right along with us. But that communication back and forth really has been invaluable to us as far as getting the agreements finalized. So we had the first 2 years we were awarded funding for planning, supplemental planning types of projects. The second year, we also had a demonstration project thrown in there that's kind of quasi-construction, but not really. We think that we've got a NEPA categorical exclusion for that one, but we have not finalized that piece yet. And then this latest round of awards, we've gotten a construction one. That one's been a little bit tricky, I'll be honest. It is being done kind of alongside a huge statewide improvement to Interstate 70 that runs through the middle of Missouri. So it's a high injury corridor that we had already identified several years ago that includes serious injuries and deaths to most vulnerable road users, so pedestrian deaths in particular. So that one's been a little bit tricky as far as getting that agreement. We're still in the process of working on that one. But for those of you who don't know, Safe Streets for All grant money does not pass through the state. So that is one less layer that we have to go through, which does, I think, speed things up. But with this project in particular, that piece has been a little bit tricky as far as how to kind of meld our project into what they're already doing in a way that won't make us go in and tear some of their project out to go back in and do it the way that would meet our standards at the city level. So that's been really one of our challenges. I did notice too in some of the comments that folks had sent before the meeting, we have problems that sounds like a lot of other cities. I know Allison and I both have things that have gotten kind of stuck in procurement. Our folks are swamped with things. There's been at times a shortage of vendors, I think, that have looked at things as we put them out because there is so much work out there right now. So we are dealing kind of with the same types of things. I would say the two things that I really could not emphasize enough would be the communication, not just with the FHWA contact, which is huge, but also internally. We've had a lot of internal meetings about how to move things forward. I'm not always the point person on some of the projects that get approved. So me staying in touch with the folks who are overseeing each of those projects to figure out how we can make those work for them and move things along has been really important. And really reach out when you have questions. Our FHWA contact has been awesome about when she doesn't have the answer, she will find it for us. and has just really taken great care and stepping us through those agreements. And if there are things that we don't understand or things that I do wrong the first time, I always understand when she wants us to go back and change something or fix it, the reasoning behind that, which I think as we progress through these agreements is really helpful because, like I said, we were all learning on that first one. And I feel like now we're able to move things more quickly just because we've all kind of learned together.
That's so helpful. And I think we'll be coming back. I think both you and Jake went through the process of seeking categorical exclusions, and it sounds like it's a real focus for this audience. So I think we'll come back to that in a next round of questions. But Alice, I wanted to pull you in because I know you're working on a Reconnecting Communities program grant, and just hear what's been sort of different there. Are you guys using a phased approach, and how have you been navigating the process of getting to a grant agreement?
Okay, so for our Reconnecting Communities and Neighborhoods, it's a planning grant, and it is for our Interstate 70 business loop, which parallels Interstate 70. And like Krista said, MoDOT is doing a huge improvement project along I-70. And so we reached out to them early on once we were noticed of the award to see if they wanted to be involved. And they did decide that they wanted to be the pass-through for us. So our agreement's a little bit different than for the Safe Streets for All because MoDOT is our pass-through for it. So, and we worked with the same point of contact at Federal Highway, and she is great to work with for both us and MoDOT. So we worked through it. It was kind of different because there was two agreements that we had to get signed. One, like the Federal Highway, was with MoDOT, but then we had to sign that one too. And then we had to have a separate agreement with MoDOT. And so MoDOT was really good at, I know for Central District, they really hadn't done this before either for MoDOT. And so our LPA contact did a lot of behind stuff with her attorneys to figure out kind of what kind of agreement they needed to have with us. And then in between working with that and the federal agreement to make sure our scope of work included everything we wanted in it, but also what MoDOT thought they needed to have included in it because of what they have going on as well. But and like Krista said, it really is just keeping on top of it when Rebecca with Federal Highway would send us an email saying, hey, can you, we got some comments on the agreement. Would you go in and address them? Kind of just doing that quick turnaround just seemed to really help to kind of, get on it and get it back to her within the next couple of days. And then if we had questions, she was always able to help. Like if I didn't understand what Federal Highway was asking or something like that. So we've had really good people to work with, which makes the agreement a lot easier to work through. And then, and I think on Federal Highway side, they were wanting to get the money up, obligated as well, the agreement through. So between their timelines and our timelines, we were able to work through and get the agreement signed in pretty quick turnaround.
That's great, Allison. Let's pivot a bit and pull Michelle into the conversation to talk. We've been focused a lot on some of these big transportation projects, but of course, transportation isn't the only funding agency under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. We have so many wonderful projects coming in partnership with the EPA. Michelle, can you tell us what's the landscape there? What are you seeing? What's challenging, and how are you sort of advising cities?
Sure, thank you. I would just echo everything that Brant said. I think it's a very similar space. Maybe I feel more dire about it because I'm so into it, but there's an overwhelming amount of funding with a lot of new EPA staff, a lot of new program officers, and a lot of new grantees. And I think one of the ways that our organization sees this is it is challenging, but it's also this incredible growth opportunity. And so just a little tiny bit of background for those who are unfamiliar, the Environmental Protection Network, we're a small 501c3 nonprofit. We have about 25 staff across the country. And we have 650 former EPA volunteers who do a variety of things, including providing pro bono bono technical assistance to frontline communities, nonprofit organizations, and under-resourced local, state, and tribal government agencies. So I will put 2 links in the chat that I think could be helpful. One is just basic information about us. So however you are figuring out how to navigate EPA and the larger federal bureaucracy, we can provide pro bono one-on-one support for that. And then number 2, just to echo everything Stephanie said, we are laser focused on getting funds obligated. And so we have created checklists, office hours, like Brant was saying, learning sessions amongst different grantee cohorts. And we, thanks to the generosity of folks like Bloomberg, we have retained a private consulting firm that is providing one-on-one assistance to folks as they work through the EPA system to get their award. So that email, that EPA-support@trccompanies.com, that is available to you. And that is fairly unlimited, meaning we will keep working with you until you get that award from EPA. Because of all the things that Stephanie mentioned at the beginning, there are plenty of pots of funding at EPA that are quite vulnerable. So I think our recommendation, 1, is to find folks like Stephanie that can explain exactly what's going on, latch onto them, do not let them go. 2, take advantage of pro bono resources. So we are one of those pro bono resources, and we are fairly well connected to other folks in the space. So if we can't do it, for example, we do a lot of partnering with Lawyers for Good Government, because we have lots of alum lawyers. Many of them are not practicing attorneys. And Lawyers for Good Government has, I think it's like 125,000 attorneys that are willing to give pro bono assistance to organizations on issues such as this. And then lastly, I would say that we are telling all of our grantees, like all the folks that we've worked with over the last many years, like, 1, this is the time to get very strictly in compliance with your financial and programmatic requirements. This is not a time where you're going back and forth and wondering and exploring with the agency. Like, this is a time to just get it right and lock that down. I think this is also a time to make sure that you have designated staff that are not involved in the project's implementation. So as Stephanie was mentioning, there is a drop dead date. If you've not spent the money at that point, it does go away. And if you want to properly deal with inquiries, investigations, audits, if you want to properly communicate the benefits of your project, that really needs to be different folks that are implementing your project. So make sure you are planning strategically if you need to raise additional funds, because you may not be able to spend funding with your grant dollars, your federal grant dollars, on that kind of work. Sometimes you are, it really just depends. Do make sure that you are preparing for those moments. And lastly, I will just put my personal email, not my personal, my work email, in the chat. Because though we do have these resources, sometimes you find yourself just in a pickle. Hey, do you happen to know if somebody could help with blah, blah, blah? This is why we exist. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. We have a lot more to discuss. We are going to put the poll, because I just want to make sure that everyone gets a chance to fill it out completely, because what it's going to do is going to ask you, have you gotten money from any of these programs, and do you need any help? And if you need, anything like Michelle was just talking about, maybe it's just a one-off question answer, but maybe it's something where you need a little more hand-holding. Please, please, please. Tell us and we'll help you. We want to see, all these dollars go out the door. So, take your time to fill it out. If you can select if you are the proud winner of multiple grant programs. Please, put all the ones that you've received there and where you might need some help. And if you've already, gotten to the grant agreement phase, we'll be sharing in the chat implementation bootcamp that we're running starting in end of January, where we're going to be working with some of our federal funding consultants and the Government Performance Lab and others on how do you do the procurements that can be really, really tricky, or what does all that reporting requirements look like, and how do you set up a grant management team for that, so that when it comes time for those audits, you are ready. All right, let's circle back and talk about categorical exclusions. Exciting stuff here. Jake, did Lansing seek a categorical exclusion, and can you tell us a little bit about the process for that?
Not that I'm aware of. So I can't really report too much detail as far as that goes. But I know that with our obligation, we followed the conditional approach of pre-NEPA award and then post-NEPA activities. So we designed our agreement just according to that, got it out the door. And so our sustainability public service department is working actively on those aspects, but right now we haven't run into categorical exclusions on our side.
Great. Brant, can you share with us, what are you seeing amongst the CFI 1B winners and NEPA? How are they sort of proceeding?
Yeah, so I mean, like Jake said, like Stephanie said as well, they're pretty much going through the two-phase process. So design phase, build phase, making sure that they've got at least one contract grant signed, and making it seem that even though they might not have everything together, and you know, that's what a lot of people were saying on the call, you don't have to have everything figured out at the time you sign that first agreement. Getting a contract agreement gives you a little bit more assurance that perhaps you will continue on with your project, given what's going on with an administration change. So, I encourage everyone to try and get, their NEPA, their pre-construction phase grant signed as quickly as possible. And just like everyone has iterated, your point of contacts for whatever department is sending out the funding, they are a great resource. They want the same thing that you do. So please make sure to use them and work as expeditiously as you can in order to get that at least first proposal, that first grant agreement signed, so that you can move forward with the entire project.
Yeah. Depending on the size of your local government too, you might have departments that have particular expertise in this area, whether we have a code compliance department, building safety division that works with a number of federal projects. And so environmental reviews is part of their bread and butter. And so these are resources that may exist already that you can lean on and may have prior experience or other advice to offer.
That's great. Krista, I think you talked about that you guys are also seeking a categorical exclusion. Can you talk a little bit about how the process is going in Columbia?
So it sounds like we're kind of in the same boat, possibly. We have not finished it yet. Just to kind of give you a really basic idea, it's for a high friction surface treatment project. It's actually a route that is state owned, but we had an agreement from them, approval from them to be able to go in and do that. But we are going to need to do it in conjunction with them resurfacing that road. I believe that project is coming up in 2 years. So since everything is going to be done in the right of way that's already established in conjunction, well, after the work that they do, we anticipate that one to be a categorical exclusion for those reasons. And Jamie, I would say a couple of things that people have mentioned and that I neglected to mention the first time, the office hours piece of that, and I think Allison might agree. Every other week, our FHWA contact has office hours specifically for SS4A grant recipients, which has been a huge help. She uses some of those sessions to have guest speakers come in and talk about a topic that will help folks either implement or work on the planning grant agreement piece of it. She also has had kickoff meetings with all of us to kind of introduce the new templates each time and talks through those point by point. I think that's probably the most helpful for me. It makes that seem much less overwhelming as we go through it. I take good notes and then go back in immediately and try to do, really what she's telling us to do. The other thing I would say, and I can't emphasize this enough, when folks are writing those grant agreements before they're executed, when you are setting deadlines for yourself for those projects that you've asked for funding for, please, please be generous with yourself. We all want to get the work done quickly, but you are in a much better position to give yourself a little bit of cushion there. You can always get that project done early and not have to go in and amend anything crazy. But if it drags on too long, you do have to go back in and do some additional work. So I would say on the front end, that is one piece of advice that I think somebody gave me early on that has been very helpful. So I wish I could speak more to the categorical exclusion. I am not the expert as far as our in-house folks go. Allison may know a little bit more about it. I just know that on this particular project, we're going to be seeking one.
And Allison, I think you were maybe the sole one here who is partnering and working with your state DOT. I know we're starting to run short on time, but how did those conversations start with the state for anyone here who might be interested in approaching their state to be sort of the pass-through entity?
Well, for me, we already have a good working relationship with our MoDOT liaison, and because we have other grant projects through them. So it was, once we talked about it internally, if that was a way that we were interested in going, it was, even for applying for the grant, we had a letter from MoDOT saying that they were, approved to, were in, how's the best way to say it? They were in agreement that of us applying for the grant, because it is actually a MoDOT maintained road anyway. And so they knew that we had been awarded the grant, and it was honestly a pretty easy to reach out and just say, hey, is this what are you interested in being the pass through? And she took it internally and got back with us. It was really kind of the first meeting that we had with FHWA and MoDOT and the city together, that we kind of talked through it, about the pros and cons of it, and decided to move forward with MoDOT being the pass through for us.
And maybe I'll just put this one out there to the city group. Have any of you experienced any difficulty with getting your city council approval or any of the other necessary stakeholders who are required to sign off on a grant agreement?
I can say that the city of Lansing has had that in the past. Usually when we receive notice of an award, ideally we'd like to have the final grant agreement in place before we send it to our governing board, but sometimes you have to move these things simultaneously. And so our grant acceptance is really within the realms of appropriation. And so when we send a grant acceptance to our city council, the form of that is really just the appropriation of funds, which allows the finance department to create the necessary accounts and have the appropriation authority to engage in those activities. And so when we get a notice of an award and we know the amount, we prepare a resolution, send what information we have, and then it's really just being aware of the process, who needs to approve it, how long does it take, because for us, we need to have it referred at our council meeting, get sent to committee, and then come back again to our city council for approval. So that takes a bit of time, and we try to roll that in. But we can also, if we know something's coming, you're going to receive a grant award in a certain amount in this frame of time, we can sort of anticipate that and give what information we know ahead of time, particularly for a major opportunity with very sensitive deadlines. So we try and keep our city council informed of those circumstances, and they try to be flexible with us, although sometimes they give us a little bit of grief over the matter. But hey, that's what we're here for, local government.
Great. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you, and we're running up on time, to Jake and Krista and Allison for the work you're doing in your cities to make them safer, more resilient, better places to live, and to Brant and Michelle for the technical assistance that you're providing to cities to help them be able to realize these projects. And I'll turn it back to David.
Great. Well, thanks to all of our panelists. Thank you to all of our panelists, all of our participants today. Please fill out the Zoom poll that Jamie mentioned if you haven't done so already. And we hope that you'll join us for our 76th session. It'll be on Tuesday, December 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern. And we'll be hosting this session on the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act funds that can be used to help your city prepare for extreme weather. So very timely topic. The registration link is in the chat. We hope to see you then. Thank you, everybody.